Okay, so what I'm going to do today is, first of all, I'm going to go over the three review questions that deal with the Ottoman Empire. Then I'm going to sort of give you the finality about the Ottomans, what happens, their decadence, and so on, taking it up to the 19th and early 20th century. And then we're going to begin to talk about, we're going to be talking about India, shifting. We're going to talk about the Mughal Empire in the early modern period and on into the 19th century. So that's the menu. So first of all, let's start with the review questions, the three review questions that deal with the Ottoman Empire. And so we start with question, the question is Mehmed II was the true founder of the Ottoman state. And I say this because you have a crystallization of what we consider to be a state system with a bureaucracy and an army and in the early modern periods, certainly a royal court and also judicial tribunals and so on. All of the accoutrements of what I described when I was talking about Western Europe of an early modern state. Well, the Ottoman state was like that. So let's talk about this question, answer this question, and the way you go about this is you talk about, first of all, the fact that the Ottomans appeared as a subordinated tribal element coming down from Central Asia in the 14th century. They became subordinates of the Seljuk Turks, who, as I explained, were struggling against the East Roman or Greek Roman Empire that had continued through the Middle Ages. And the struggle went on in Anatolia and Turkey. And the Ottomans, as I say, were subordinated warriors, Islamic warriors, against the Byzantine state, the East Orthodox state. Well, as time wore on, they particularly developed their power in the Balkans. The Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles, separating Turkey from the Balkans, and they invaded the Balkans, and they basically, by the late 14th, early 15th century, there were a series of kingdoms, and the Ottomans dominated those kingdoms. But this was a kind of decentralized setup. One can't really speak about it as a state. But in the course of the first part of the 15th century, you do begin to see, first of all, the Byzantines, the Greek Orthodox, the Christians are being defeated, and the Ottomans are getting stronger and stronger, and they basically free themselves from the Seljuks, and they come to dominate both the Turks in Anatolia and in the Balkans. And in 1453, under Mehmed II, this is the big event, the Ottomans seize the Christian city of Constantinople and they rename it Istanbul. And this marks the full crystallization of the Ottoman state under Mehmed II. And in discussing that, I talked about the fact that in the siege, the Ottomans were able to deploy both a large army and a very substantial fleet. A navy was necessary, and they had developed a sufficiently powerful navy. They had modern weapons. including cannon, the help of the Italians I mentioned, um, and the Janissaries had already appeared. The system of Devzerm was already beginning to crystallize and was crystallizing under Mehmed II. And so they seized the city, and in order to repopulate the city, whose population had fallen from 80,000, Mehmed ordered that subject populations move to Constantinople in order to build it up again. And the army repaired many of the public buildings, the palaces, the walls of the city, and uh, Mehmed's conception was a new Rome, an Islamic Rome. He was creating an Islamic Rome. And in addition to that, you have the sort of establishment of the religious aspect of this in the form of the revival of the old Arab caliphates. There's now an Ottoman caliphate, and the Sultan is both the political leader, but he's also the caliph. And he's the ultimate authority uh, 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 on matters religious as well as political. And of course, um, the um, there is now under Mehmed the creation of a bureaucracy. So we have this military force, we have a bureaucracy which is collecting taxes and tribute. There's a nascent. It's obviously it's all going to be perfected, but there's clearly a financial system coming into being, and the military institution is developing, as I had explained. And of course, we saw, this is getting to the end of this, Mehmed invites the Jews who are being expelled from Spain and from Europe. Many of them immigrate to the Ottoman Empire, where they become important in terms of manufacturing, trade, and banking. So there's that, and he begins to he finds a place for the Greeks, who after all are the conquered people, the Greeks who live in Greece, on the Greek islands, and also in Anatolia, and have lived there because it was this whole area was all part of the Byzantine Empire, the old East Roman Empire. So the Greeks were now the subject people, and they also were given a role. We saw they were merchants, they're craftsmen, and above all, the Ottomans found them useful in terms of developing maritime commerce and the navy. The Greeks were very important in terms of the Ottoman navy. And we could say finally that the millet system is beginning. It starts really with Mehmed, but it takes a long time for it to fully crystallize. We can say it's fully established by about 1600, but you can see in the way he deals with the Jews and the Greeks that the millet system is coming into being. Now, the next question, that's that question, basically develops the whole question of the place of the Jews and the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. And we saw that the Jews, there were, under the Byzantines, there were Jewish people living in the Byzantine Empire. These Jews were referred to as Romani because they were part of the old Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Romani Jews. Then there were the Arab Jews, and we saw that Selim conquers the Arab Middle East, and there are many Arab Jews living there, so they're part of the Ottoman Empire. So there's Romani, there's Arabs, and then from Europe, from Spain, And all of this is in key words. These terms are all found in key words. There are the Sephardic Jews, and then in Central and Eastern Europe, there are the Ashkenazim Jews. Um, so they're all sort of brought in, and the Greeks, as I explained, who are the subject people in Anatolia, in the Balkans, and in Greece, they also fulfill many of these similar roles. They're merchants, they're craftsmen, they're farmers. The Greeks are farmers, but they're also, the specialty is maritime commerce and the Ottoman Navy. And both the Greeks and the Jews then, they become part of the millet system. The subject people, the people who are not Muslim, are the protected flock, and they each are allowed their separate millet. The Greek Orthodox, the Jewish, the Armenian. The Armenians are merchants, and of course there is the Muslim millet, but they're the upper class. And the people who are in the non-Islamic millets, they have to pay a tribute to the Ottoman upper class, to the state, but they're allowed self-government, religious self-government, and also a sort of local self-government is basically in the hands of each religious community and are self-governing. And of course, what I would say further, what should be said, is that this kind of a setup can never really develop into a kind of the middle class, which becomes so important in places like Holland and England, as we have seen. The middle comes to rival the old landlord class, and ultimately you see in Europe, in Holland and England, capitalist revolution by the merchants. Well, the merchants are all distributed amongst these different millets, separated, and they could never come together in some sort of. It's only toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, that you can say that a middle class establishes itself in Anatolia, in Turkey, in the late Ottoman Empire. Toward the very end of the empire, you see a middle class. But up until then, there's no real middle class. Now, the last thing I would say is that we should note that from the 17th century onwards, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to become decadent, decline sets in. In this decline, everybody is suffering, but the Armenians and the Greek Orthodox population does better than the Jews and the Arabs. As I've explained, they tend to be favored by the Europeans, and the Jews and the Arabs are not. And I talked about the development of Islamic mysticism and messianic expectations on the part of the Jews. This incredible incident where this character Sabbatai Sevi claims that he's the Messiah, etc. So that takes care of that question. The last question that we're dealing with today is the explain the decay of the Ottoman Empire. And here, of course, this we did, I guess, in the last lecture. So just to repeat, what were the factors? What's the fact? Well, the quality of political leadership is number one. The quality of the sultans. When you think that there's Mehmed II, who establishes basically the state. You have Salim, who takes the Arab Middle East, and then you have Solomon the Magnificent, who establishes the limits. He seizes Iraq, he seizes the southern Ukraine and southern the Caucasus, southern Russia, uh, North Africa, uh, becomes part of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula. The empire is at its maximum by the end of the reign of Solomon, 1566. But thereafter, the quality of the sultans declines, and I said uh, that is an expression of what is going on below, that social and economic factors do play a part. And in terms of the decay of politics, I talked about the court, the corruption in the court, the intrigue in the harem, favoritism, different families vying for power, positioning their relatives regardless of their qualities, bribery, even coup d'états happening. So this is number one. But the second thing is, in particular, this political difficulties amongst the elite expresses itself in terms of the rivalry between the Devzerm Janissary element and the Turkish element, the rivalry from the mid 16th century. Ongoing rivalries between the Christian kids who have been basically uh, sort of converted to Islam, and they're the Janissaries, and some of them become political leaders, but they have a memory, and they form a faction, and the Turks, the pure genealogically Turkish, is the rival faction, and they're fighting. Okay, so the elite is divided, basically, I would say. But very important, probably most important, is the economic factor. Remember, this Spain begins to decline in the opening decades of the 17th century. The silver, it it declines from Latin America, but also now the Atlantic route to Asia becomes the dominant route, and the Mediterranean loses its importance. And so the whole sort of, there is a decline in economic activity, and the state has less resources. So that's important. And of course, in which is typical, it's not merely the Ottoman landlord class or elite and the government that does this. They don't have enough revenue to maintain the state administration and the palaces and the luxury way of life of the upper class. So they basically impose heavier taxes on the productive population. The merchants, the craftsmen, the peasants have to pay more. Taxes are increased in order to maintain the government. And this impoverishes the productive people in Ottoman society. And so that's a very important factor. I also made something of the fact that you have this institutionalized religious structure, which is overlaps with the state. It's based on Sunni Islam, and it becomes it was always conservative. It becomes more and more conservative as things get worse, and so you have an intolerance of secular trends, secular thoughts, while the Europeans are beginning to break through with technology and science and rational philosophy. No, not in the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, even I pointed out that the literacy rates. They don't allow publication until the 18th century, free circulation of books. And so, whereas in the West, literacy is growing rapidly, and therefore general awareness, that's not happening in the Ottoman Empire. And then the intrusion of the Europeans. The Europeans are getting stronger and stronger. The European navies, French, English, and Dutch, I would stress the French role. France is a Mediterranean power, and the French in the 17th century, they're strong. Richelieu, Louis XIV, well, they become very influential, both politically and militarily, but also commercially. I would say in the 17th and 18th century, the French are dominant. Ultimately, England is, you'll see, dominates everywhere by the latter half of the 18th century. But in the initial period, the French were important. Well, these people, the Europeans, have big naval vessels, men of war. They have the most highly developed military technology, and they also are developing a certain manufacturing capacity, and they basically impose themselves on the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Sultan is forced to sign capitulation treaties, allowing the Europeans to have their own courts. The Europeans become exempt from the laws of ordinarily which the subjects in the Ottoman Empire are liable to. Well, no, the Europeans have their own special courts. It's called extraterritoriality. So that's a symptom of a growing European power. So I would say that in the course of the 17th century, what you're getting is a growing sort of inequality in the relationship. It's political, but it's also economic. And in terms of the exchange, that is, say, of what the Ottomans are able to sell to Europe and what they're able to buy, this is what we call unequal exchanges occurring. And so the money is moving toward Europe. A condition of economic dependency develops. And this is very important because I mentioned that this had already happened in Latin America in the 16th century, and now you see in the 17th century the Europeans do not outright conquer the Ottoman Empire. No. What they do is they subordinate it. And you're seeing a process. You'll see the same thing happen to India. The same thing happens to China. Step by step, the Europeans basically establish a position of a superiority, certainly by the late 18th century. And the global South has become politically and economically dependent on the Europeans, and there is unequal exchange. And as one scholar put it, Europe develops, and the third world, the global South, underdevelops. It's a simultaneous process. The Europeans, the West gets richer, and everybody else gets poorer. That's what I would say. Last thing is the growing military imbalance. The West has its military revolution. In the Ottoman Empire, there are the Janissaries, there was the old cavalry, and under Mehmed IV, remember, I said that the Ottomans attempted a revival. They did succeed in 1649 in taking the island of Crete, which is one of the largest islands in the Mediterranean, took it away from the Venetians, who were weak. But when they tried, in echoing what Suleiman the Magnificent had done, besiege Vienna, 1529, now again in 1683, they tried to take Vienna. A large Ottoman army advances on Vienna. Well, the Europeans, coalition of European princes send their armies. All of these armies are equipped and supplied in a sophisticated way. And so the Ottomans lose at Vienna in 1683. And basically, this sort of reveals the fundamental weakness. And it's serious because now, by the end of the 17th and 18th century, the Europeans are, whereas in the 16th century, West Europe was rather far away. It took many days of travel and so on to get to the Eastern Mediterranean. By the 18th century, and especially the Austrian Empire, the Habsburgs in Vienna, and the Russians up there in Moscow, they have modern military apparatus. And so in the 18th century, there's no reform of the Ottoman military. And so the Ottomans are chased out of the northern part of the Balkans. The Habsburgs take places like Croatia or part of Serbia is occupied by the Habsburgs, but also the Russians now, the southern Ukraine, southern Russia, around the Black Sea, the Caucasus. The Russian Empire expands and seizes these areas. Now, that, I think, is all I'm going to say about that. I'm now going to turn back and sort of briefly deal with the sort of the end of the Ottoman Empire. Somebody asked me about, somebody came up, I think it was you, who asked about the Jews and their economic role. Now, this is a sensitive subject. As we know, in the West, including Canada, but everywhere, the Jews have a certain economic role. Well, let me try to explain the realities. The realities are that the Jews did not own land in the Middle Ages. They could not own land. They basically, their activities that were confined to sort of retail commerce, trade, and usury. Usury was forbidden to Christians, and so the Jews lent money, and that's not all Jews, but the people who had money, a minority amongst the Jews who did this. Now, okay, that's what they did. So there are two things to say about this. First of all, if you look at these kinds of activities, historians refer to this, the Jewish community, as a diaspora community. Diaspora means that people, they do not live in their homeland, they live outside of their homeland, and they live amongst the people, other people who are not the same as they are. Well, the Jews are not the only diaspora. In the contemporary world, we can point to the fact that many Armenians are living outside of Armenia, and they are merchants, and they do some of the things that Jews have done. Likewise, we can talk to the fact that there is a Lebanese diaspora, and they do the same thing. And we can say that the Palestinians, if you look at Latin America, you see that in many places in Latin America, there are Palestinian merchants and people who are active in this way. And more important than any of these, there is, and you'll see this when we come to China, outside of China from the 13th century, there developed what we call the overseas Chinese, the overseas China. All over Asia, there is diasporic communities of Chinese. And these overseas Chinese, you could say, are the equivalent of the Jews and are subject to the same hostility as the Jews are. Periodically, there will be uprisings and riots against the Chinese in places like Indonesia or the Philippine Islands. In the Philippine Islands, the upper class is largely made up of Chinese, and there is an underlying resentment of their domination. The second thing to say is, of course, the Jews are associated with capitalism. Well, they are associated with capitalism, but I would say rather more this kind of economic role has to be understood in terms of pre-capitalist society, because the real leaders, if we're looking at ethnic groups who invented capitalism, as Max Weber pointed out, and I referred to you, Max Weber, he wrote this famous book, Protestantism and the Spirit of Capitalism. And it is the Protestants in England, in Scotland, in Holland, who were the pioneers with the Protestant ethic of capitalism. Eventually, of course, some Jews joined in, is what I'm saying. But they were always, and still are, even though some Jews are powerful in this world, they are subordinate. Which brings me to, I'm taking this further, I'm going to talk about modern Jewish nationalism. And I take this out, I'm going to talk about several things at this point, because we're going to talk about India eventually, but I want to get onto this because it's underneath in any way. And we see that the Manitoba government has now bringing in a piece of legislation which basically, and this is now supported by the NDP, the opposition. They are bringing in a piece of legislation promoted by the Zionist lobby, basically saying that anybody who criticizes Israel and its politics is an anti-Semite. And this is becoming law in Manitoba. We'll see what happens. I may not be able to say this when it does become, I may not be able to mention this. But of course, it's an assault on free speech and free discussion and so on. And I would say to sort of move, so that's the last thing I'm going to say about this. But I want to say that there is a lot and an increasing amount of censorship going on in society. People cannot say what they think. It's partly political correctness. It's, all sorts of things. And there is manipulation of public opinion going on. The CBC is censoring the news. It's censoring the news about Latin America, where, if you follow what's happened today, in Brazil, the socialists have taken over Brazil, and they have come to power all over Latin America because the conditions are intolerable. But if you look at the North American press, including the Canadian press and the CBC, they obscure, they do not discuss this. And the same thing, they really are not telling the truth about the war which is going on in the Ukraine. Because what is going on in the Ukraine is that the Russians are winning the war. And you will not hear that, but that is what's going on. The CBC has become a complete mouthpiece um, for the Canadian government. Has lost all critical perspective, and you're just simply not hearing. So my final word of, oh yes, one last thing. In Haiti now, Haiti, which is the most miserable country in Latin America, a quasi-revolution has broken out. And what is the discussion? The United States, Canada, and France. We need to send military force to suppress this. And there's a big fight going on between these three governments because the Americans want the Canadians and the French to basically send their military into Haiti or reinforce their military. And the French government and the Canadian government is saying, no, 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 no. No. We've done your bidding, but after you, Monsieur. That is to say, after Uncle Sam. So this is the struggle. You won't hear a word about any of this. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is you have to become critical. You have to become aware. You have to find other sources. We are now shifting gears to India. Um, so, so we saw in the course of what I said that there were three great Islamic empires in the early modern period. There was the Ottoman Empire, there was the Persian Empire, which we're not dealing with. I'd say about the Persian Empire, of course, it's Shiite, as I explained, the difference, Sunni Shiite. But the thing about the Persian Empire, one of the most distinctive is their cultural achievement. The Persians, the Persian upper class, the craftsmanship of the Persians became the standard, both in the Ottoman Empire and, as you'll see, in the Mughal Empire. The quality of their production and artistic production, craft production, even their language was imitated by other Islamic people because it reached a high level of refinement, which is based, of course, on the tastes of the upper class and the quality of the craftsmen. But we're not dealing with, we can't deal with everything, so we're dealing with this large state in the 16th, well, even previously, India was essentially dominated by Muslims. And in the period that we're dealing with, the Muslims who dominated India from the 16th century onwards until the British took over in the 18th century, in this whole period, were the Mughals, the Mughal Empire, from 1526 until 1756. The Mughals ruled India. And what does Mughal mean? It means Mongol. It's literally, it's the same word. Mughal means Mongol, which indicates that the Islamic ruling group, their origins were Central Asian. They were Turkish. Linguistically and genealogically, it's another Turkish tribe that takes over, just as the Ottomans. You see the same thing. Well, this happened in India as well. So I want to talk in the few minutes that are left about a little bit about the background, the general context, before we get into this sort of historical narrative. The contact between India and the West began rather early, limited contact between the West, and particularly it started with the Greeks back in the ancient world, talking about Plato, Aristotle, that period, there was contact between India and the West, and there was a historian. I have mentioned his name in the keywords. His name was Herodotus, and he wrote a work called Histories. It was the first serious piece of history. And there's a lot of anthropology in some of it is sort of weird. But Herodotus wrote this history, and it's still a classic work. And he does discuss India in that work. We're talking about the 5th century BC, this historian. And from that point onwards, people do have a sense there is this place called India in the West. They understand it, but it's sort of, it was from the point of view of the Greeks and later on the Romans, this was the furthest reach. It was this very distant and exotic place that few people had ever really seen and so on. And it was seen as a land of marvels, people with strange manners and customs. I'm talking about the Greek view and later the Roman view. Herodotus' account became the standard account and was later on other Greek and Roman historians added a few things. They got some accounts from travelers, and so Herodotus would be the main narrative, but then there were certain additions in terms of what people knew. The word Indian or India comes from a certain area of India known as Hind, Hind, keyword, Hind, which then became India. Okay, that's where the word comes from. Well, I would say that, of course, the sense of India by the Greeks and the Romans was very limited. They didn't really know very much about it, but I would say that at least we can say that it's true that India was very different from Greece or later Rome. It was a different place. And one indication of this is the fact that there is such a thing as the writing of history. The Greeks wrote history. The Romans wrote history. Even the medieval Europeans kept chronicles. Likewise, the Arabs in the Middle Ages, they wrote chronicles. None of these were very sophisticated. They harped on the doings of the great generals, the great men, and the great military battles. It's all about politics. And you see the same thing in China. The Chinese wrote history from an early date, and it's all about the great men, moral examples. There's no real sort of, in my opinion, sort of social or economic analysis, anything like that. It's just this kind of what we call political history of a simple kind. But with the Indians, there was no history. The literature we have is essentially religious. The culture of India was, now the Europeans and the others I've mentioned, the Ottomans, of course, religion is central. But the Indians, it's all about religion. It's all about religion. The literature we have, there virtually is no secular culture. It's all about religion. So that is true, and this is deeply, and of course, the Muslims themselves were very religious, and so it just reinforced Indian culture was, and I would say still is, deeply marked by religion in a very, very profound way. Well, um, let's look now at the way the West has viewed India. In the same way as the West has viewed Islam as hopelessly religious, backward, et cetera, incapable of uh, modernization, if you like. That's the West's uh, prejudiced view of the Middle East and the Islamic people. Um, I would say it was doubly true of the way they thought about India. India was predominantly not Muslim. The Muslims became a considerable minority, but it was Hinduism. The majority of the Indians were Hindus. That is the religion. We have dealt with Christianity. We have noticed Islam, and now we're dealing with mainly a another religion, Hinduism. And what the Westerners said, well, this religion is, these people are hopelessly religious, and India is, as a result, is an impoverished country. Even worse, they organize their society in terms of castes. They have the caste system. They have untouchables. Some people at the bottom rung, the people run away from them because they're untouchable. And of course, the treatment of women is terrible in India, and they would say much the same about the Islamic world. And again, it's Max Weber who codified this at the beginning of the 20th century. He not only wrote about capitalism, he wrote about other religions as well and compared them. And he talks about Hinduism. And basically, he says that the nature of Hinduism basically this religion leads people away from being concerned with the material world. Therefore, there could be no development in India. It's hopelessly blocked. Whereas Christianity, particularly the Protestant form of Christianity, is progressive. However, note that India, which was subject to conquest by successive conquerors who became landlords, who exploited the common people, especially the peasantry. That was the history, you'll see, is the history of India. And then it was conquered by the British, who intensified the exploitation. India became basically the jewel, if that's what it was called, the jewel of the British Empire, because the British made so much money by exploiting India that, of course, it was the jewel. So look what happened when in 1947, the British basically were kicked out of India in 1947, and India became independent. India experienced rapid economic development and has experienced, having got rid of they're still, don't get me wrong, there are landlords there and they're oppressive, but somehow the small peasants, they enjoy a certain margin, or there are certain elements of the Indian peasantry have become prosperous. And of course, there's been this huge development in industry in India, and it is one of the leading economic powers in the world. I would say, yes, that's, in other words, get rid of colonialism, get rid of feudalism, and the Indians are still Hindus. In fact, they have become, the majority there now is under a government which is controlled by Hindu fundamentalists. Terrible people. But from an economic point of view, India, especially the upper class. So I'll stop and we'll continue.